What If's fifth episode, What If Zombies, has officially aired on Disney+. I was pretty excited for this episode because Marvel Zombies is something I've wanted to see in the MCU for a while, and with Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness being a horror, this seemed like a pretty good segue into that genre. Unfortunately, I found this episode to be extremely underwhelming. This is the first episode of what so far has been a pretty awesome show that just didn't work for me. Despite this episode having a similar length and runtime to the previous episodes, it just feels rushed. Most of the scenes don't feel like they're given enough time to breathe, and a lot of character moments such as Bucky being forced to kill a zombified Steve Rogers feel lacking in emotional impact. Yes, you could argue that it is pretty emotional seeing characters like Cap, Iron Man, and Doctor Strange as bloodthirsty zombies, but I would argue that the emotional impact is significantly decreased due to the reactions of the surviving characters. When Bucky kills zombie Cap, he doesn't look sad about it or even sound like it. He's just mildly annoyed, which seemed odd considering Steve and Bucky are best friends. Even when Okoye kills zombie Falcon, Bucky doesn't really seem to express any genuine emotion and instead decides to crack a joke, which I found to be way out of character and out of place considering the circumstances. Speaking of the comedy, I have criticized the comedy in this show a number of times already, but this is the first episode where the comedy really annoyed me. Characters just constantly make jokes in scenes where it just isn't appropriate, which almost completely destroys the tone. It took away tension from most of the episode because it never feels like the characters are genuinely terrified. Zombie Scarlet Witch was built up as this scary, powerful, and monstrous man-eating killing machine, but when the survivors eventually encounter her, I couldn't take it seriously because throughout the entire scene, Ant-Man is just constantly making jokes, really unfunny ones at that. The characters also do and say things that just didn't make sense to me and felt very out of character, the worst offender being Vision kidnapping innocent people, including T'Challa, and feeding them to Scarlet Witch. I know, this show is about what ifs, and this is a different dimension. However, this dimension largely follows an identical timeline to that of the main universe timeline, with the zombie outbreak in this timeline only taking place during the events of Ant-Man and the Wasp, which is set just before Infinity War. So this Vision would have gone through the same character beats that the main universe Vision did prior to Infinity War, which is why it doesn't make sense to me at all that he would do this, even if it is just out of love. I also didn't get why Wasp didn't use the ants to fight the zombies more. We see her in the beginning using them to literally shred zombie Iron Man, Strange, Ebony Maw, and Black Dwarf to bits. Hilariously, they never do this again, which didn't make sense because I feel it could have been used on multiple occasions when the survivors were surrounded by zombies, for example. Why doesn't anyone, not even Wasp, think to use that more than once? Also, how the fuck did Thanos get bitten? No, seriously, how did that even happen? He couldn't have been bitten on Titan because Tony and Strange already became zombies before they could have ever met Thanos, or the Guardians for that matter. He couldn't have been bitten by Thor or the Guardians because the outbreak is on Earth and not in space. It's also worth mentioning that Thanos fought Iron Man with 4 Infinity Stones, and when Iron Man punches Thanos with a giant iron boxing glove thing, it barely leaves a scratch. I don't believe for a second that teeth were able to break through Thanos' skin, especially considering how easily the zombies are cut down in this episode, and the fact that zombie Thanos is in possession of 5 Infinity Stones. Teeth would shatter when coming into contact with that. The zombies themselves just weren't that intimidating. They seemed pretty easy to kill. I mean, it doesn't take Bucky long to cut Cap in half. Strange, Stark, and 2 of the Black Order are eaten by ants. The only zombie that seemed even remotely scary was the Hank Pym zombie, mainly because all it took for him to infect Cap was him shrinking and then biting Cap like he was a mosquito. That, I won't lie, was pretty terrifying. But beyond that, the zombies are pretty lackluster. They're pretty slow, clumsy, and the ones that carry ranged weapons don't seem to be able to aim. I don't want to sound like I hated this episode, because I didn't. There were a few things that I really liked. The biggest highlight for me was actually Spider-Man. Hudson Thomas did such a perfect impression of Tom Holland that I legit forgot the voice was not Tom Holland's. He did a fantastic job capturing the youthful, positive energy of the MCU's Peter Parker. I loved the scene where he's explaining to a dying Hope why he was able to stay so upbeat and positive despite the situation. I really love his line about smiling when no one else can. It's a really good line and also a great message for kids about remaining positive in tough situations. Uncle Ben finally got a mention, which was also pretty neat. Spidey's journey in this episode was really endearing. He was the only character with an arc that felt satisfying and well developed, and out of all the characters in this episode, I latched onto him the most. The voice acting for the most part is all great. Everyone does a fine job with what they have to work with. The animation animation is also still pretty stellar. The lighting was used very effectively to make a pretty chilling atmosphere, and the use of color as usual was great. Unfortunately, I didn't really like much else about this episode. It's really reminded me of Black Widow in that it feels like a filler chapter that didn't really need to happen. It fails to justify its own existence, and it doesn't feel like a story that anyone was really yearning to tell. It feels like this story was included because there's been high demand for a Marvel Zombies story in the MCU, so of course including it in this series would draw audiences to it. While not terrible, this episode for me doesn't live up to the hype. It's a rushed, inconsistently told story lacking in substance, and I'm gonna give it a 3.5 out of 10. So that was my review of What If Episode 5. I do hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much as always for watching. Before I go though, I would just like to ask you guys, what did you think of What If Episode 5? Good? Bad? Somewhere in the middle? Please leave your thoughts down in the comments below, and I will indeed see you guys in the next one. Until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you. Always.